Well, hello everybody, and literally a very warm welcome to what is now the fourth webinar in our Virtual Academy of Large-Scale Change series. Really happy to welcome you along today. So we're going to get started. I'm Elaine Bayliss, and I will be back to being your facilitator today, along with my colleagues who are going to be helping us in chat, Ian Smith and Michael Anderson, and also my colleague Jane Whittam. So as we get going, please do join in and engage with us. Let us know who you are and where you're joining us from in the chat box, and there'll be lots of opportunities to interact as we run through the session today. As ever, we also have the wonderful Rachel Gray standing by in the background, who will help to deal with all things technical in WebEx. So if you're having any issues at all with WebEx, please do get in touch with Rachel through chat. Lots of instructions have been shared with you through there about voice and sound if you're having any trouble at all connecting. Okay, so today we are really looking forward to a session that's going to be led for us by Catherine Pereira, who is the Head of Transformation within the NHS Horizons team. And as you can see from Catherine's bio, she has the most amazing biography and background in dealing and working with people in large-scale change across the system and really understanding the psychology of narrative and mobilisation. So without any more ado from myself, I'm going to pass over to Catherine. And Catherine, it's over to you to lead us through the session.
Lovely, Elaine. Thank you. Can you hear me clearly?
We can hear you loud and clear. Thanks, Catherine.
Lovely. Hello everyone, what a pleasure it is to be here today, and hello from a very sunny central London. So as we go through our session, you may hear bells ringing out occasionally. I've been listening to them over the past half hour, so a little bit of background noise there, but otherwise we'll be fine. So we're going to be focusing today on mobilising and organising. It's a pleasure to be with you here today, and I'd like to do this in an interactive way. So we have a number of ways of enabling that, and some of you will be seasoned experts. For some of you it will be new. We have the chat box that Elaine referred to, and I can see a number of people using that already. If you want to use that, it's the top right icon on your screen, and you can click in there and select that you want to send it to all participants, all attendees. Send us a message and let us know where you're coming from today, where you work. It would also be good to know what you're hoping to get from today's session. I'm going to pause the session at various points and take feedback from the chat box and try and address some of the things that are coming up. So please do that, and Elaine will be helping me along with the team to keep a track of everything that you're saying. So if you've not done so yet, jump in the chat box and have a go right now. And to get us started, before we jump into the content, I want to just start by getting a sense of who we have in our room, in our virtual room. So Rachel is going to open a poll for us in a moment, and we're going to use this question to kick off. How confident do you feel to mobilise or organise for change with others? So that might be confident because you've got some skills or previous experience, and I can see the poll popping up on the right. So if you look at the right hand side of the screen, we've got about 30 seconds there on a scale of 1 to 10. So 1 is that you really don't feel confident at all, you've got very little experience or skills. 10 is that you are a Jedi Master, a la Professor Marshall Ganz, and possibly you think that you're somewhere in between. So if you just use those 1 to 10 and let us know. And Rachel, how long do we have left on the poll? I think we're going to be coming through now. Looks like it's closing. Ah, interesting. Okay, so we have the fat middle, as it usually is, a kind of rump of people kind of picking the middle. We've got a few people on the call who say they feel very experienced, and one person highly experienced. So I think I need to meet you and learn from you as well. But a good spread. So most people, it seems, are maybe familiar with some of the concepts, but maybe, and you can put in the chat box, what would help you to feel more confident, whether it's thinking about how to apply it or doing a deep dive on any particular aspect of what we're going to cover today, and then we can flex our sessions accordingly. So what I want to start with is really a provocation. You know, why does this matter? So what? Why would we want to mobilise or organise people in order to make change with them rather than doing to? And there are lots of different ways of looking at this question from a large-scale change perspective. I quite like this quote from Jonathan Harris, who is a writer, an artist, and he says this. He says, you know, I think people have begun to forget how powerful human stories are, exchanging their sense of empathy for a fetishistic fascination with data, networks, patterns, and total information. Really, the data is just part of the story. The human stuff is the main stuff, and the data should enrich it. So, I think that's a very provocative statement, a very challenging statement for those of us who work in health and care, to think about where our focus is. And really the basis of what we are going to cover today is narrative, is story, and how methodologies and approaches to story can be used in order to move people to action, big or small, in order to change the world. So what we're talking about here is very much an art rather than a science. And Sue Tibbles, who's a wonderful social change activist who runs the Sheila McKechnie Foundation, she says this, in this context, pursuing social change is much more of an art than a science. There's no fixed model, no curricula, no rules, no guarantee. It's about reading power, building relationships, framing issues, honing messages, mobilizing supporters, bringing pressure to bear. And all of this in an increasingly complex network society in which assumptions that we had even a year ago no longer hold. So that's the challenge, and that's what we're trying to meet. How do we, in circumstances of complexity, focus on why would people join in rather than why don't they? Focus on what moves people to action rather than what compels them. Focus on choice rather than mandate. And all of these things are what social movement approaches, organizing, mobilizing, speak to. In part, this is about re-remembering purpose. This idea of purpose being an invisible leader in our team, in our organization, being something that we have. And it's not just an intangible vision. It's about really trying to understand, what are the values that I have? How do I know I have those values? What values do I share with others? And re-remembering those in order to build a kind of shared purpose and a story. So I remember one moment in my career when I was brought awake, when I was invited in a very visceral way to re-remember purpose in my life. I used to practice as a barrister, and I litigated in the High Court, Court of Appeal and other areas for 4 years. And I practiced public law and employment law as well. I remember the last case that I ever did before I realized that I had to leave that career. I had been paid by a bank to represent them in court against a woman whom they had sacked. When I read the paper, it was pretty clear to me that she had been sacked in ways that were shoddy but not technically unfair. She was asking the bank for £1,000 to settle her claim, and rather than pay her that, they paid me £1,000 to go to court and get her claim knocked out on technicality. So I rocked up at the court with my wig and my gown, ready to go, and she was sat there on her own in the waiting room, small woman, probably 40 years of age. She was sat on her own because she couldn't afford legal representation, and I went over to her, as is my duty, to explain to her what was about to happen, that her claim was going to be knocked out on a technicality. And I talked her through this. And as we spoke, she told me that she had lost her marriage because of the strain that being unemployed had put on her, that she'd lost her home because they couldn't afford the payments on the mortgage. She talked a little bit about her struggles with mental health. And as I talked through what would happen in court, she reached over, put her hand on my knee, and she said, "Okay, look, you're just doing your job." And it was a wake-up call for me. Because which among us, who among us wants to be just doing her job? Who comes into the NHS or public service or public law to just be doing a job? And it was that day that I went home and I wrote my resignation letter and I handed it into Chambers. And what it did for me was to unlock some space to really ask some hard questions about purpose. I became involved in campaigning, discovered this whole world of methods and approaches that were about what do we do when the only resource we have is our people? How do we move people to want to change their world at whatever place they find themselves for the better? And you know, this idea of every day thinking through how we move with others, through others, to make a better world is really at the heart of what I went on to do, which was to run a community organising hub called Movement for Change, and how I tried to be in the world with the members of parliament I was working with the young women in Swansea and Barrow and Furness and Glasgow and other areas where we were organising. And so much of that, you know, is summarised in what Jo Cox, who I worked with, stood for, which is believing that we can have a better world and fighting to make it happen every day. Okay, so I want to root it in that context. This is about a moment now where every day we make choices as to how we make the world a better place. And really that starts by seeing our task in two sides. The first side is what we do, our head, our analysis, the structure, and that is critical for any work for a large-scale change improvement process in the NHS or any other context. But equally important, and I would suggest what we often under-resource or ignore or don't quite know how to realise, is this question of why we do it. You know, why would we join in? And so much of that question comes from narrative, from the heart, and from this idea of motivation, you know, movement. If you think about the root of the word emotion, it's motion, movement. We talk about films that moved us, speeches that literally moved the way we thought about what was possible. So the question that we're going to explore today is, how do we bring that movement into the way that we approach large-scale change in health and care? So I'm going to come to the chat monitors to see what you've been saying or asking about this so far. So do please keep commenting in the chat box. Before I do that, I just want to lay out 4 points of context for what we're talking about. Again, why this matters. So, you know, often in the healthcare system, as I go around and do coaching and workshops, the word permission is all pervasive. You know, we often talk about the permissions that I don't have to act. And, you know, many times when we think about this question, don't we? We think of it as an external. You know, what permission do I have within the structure? What rules are there? What am I allowed to do or not allowed to do? One of the things I think mobilizing and organizing approaches call on us to do is to start with me and to think about what permissions externally do I already have? And what is it that is making me unwilling or feeling unable to seize them? So what I'm doing here is drawing a distinction between what is the real issue when we choose not to act together? Is it a permission issue which is externally generated? And that's one thing. Or is it a question of self-efficacy, my own sense that I can make a change in the world? And really that's an internally generated piece. So any method that is around campaigning and organising and mobilising tends to start with the question of self, the question of me. What is it that in the space that I'm in can I enable for others so that they can act? And by extension, do I already have the external permission that I need in order to go on and prototype, test in micro ways, try new approaches that will add up to a bigger benefit? So that's the first piece of context. The second one is this, and this is a frame that comes from political activism. So Jeremy Hymans and Henry Timms, if you think of any big social movement platform like Avaz, Get Up, Change.org, Purpose, Move On, any of the big petition sites of the last 15 years, these guys have either created them or architected them or helped to fund make them happen. And what they did in the book that they published earlier this year was to distill down what they've learned about power into a simple frame. So what they say is that power is simply my ability to act. Or Martin Luther King would say, one's ability to achieve purpose. And the question is, what do I do with that ability to act? And that's where the value set comes in. And what they say is that in the world, there is an increasingly explicit tension between old power. So old power operates like a currency. I have it, I give it to you, you have it. It's finite. It's held by few people. It tends to operate through structures, be pushed down and commanded. It tends to thrive in circumstances where information is closed and can be controlled. And it relies predominantly on what we need to do and how we get it done, what I would call physical energy. What this frame does is to contrast that with what's called new power. So new power is, if you think of it in video game terms, it's more like Minecraft. It's a space where anybody can join in, collaborate and build. So it relies on creating a current, an energy that other people will be attracted to. In its operating model, it relies on radical transparency, starting from a mindset that we share unless there's a reason not to, that we build on each other's strengths. And crucially, it's about relationship, it's about why we do what we do and who we are as a precursor to planning what it is we're going to do together in the world. And what this frame says to me is not that one is better than the other, not that one will always be more appropriate than the other, not that one is becoming more dominant and the other obsolete, but that we need both to be used appropriately in order to make and sustain large-scale change. And actually, in the last 10 years, what we've seen with technology and the way the world is changing and new era approaches is that our ability to harness new power is exponentially increased compared to even 5 years ago. And yet our institutions, such as the National Health Service, local authorities and others, haven't kept pace in the way that we think about making change, with this ability now to harness new power where appropriate, as well as old power. So that's the second idea. Two more quickly, and then we'll pause and see what's coming through in the chat. So this is an old idea, and it's another way of thinking about relationships. It comes from Alexis de Tocqueville, who was a French philosopher. And when the United States was born as a country in the 18th century, he visited. And he was blown away by what he found. Small pockets of people organizing in small ways together through their relationships to make change happen. And he saw with great prescience added up to an extraordinary democratic potential that had never been realized before in modern times. And he said this knowledge of how we combine is the mother of all other forms of knowledge, and on its progress depends that of all others. So I suppose this is my way of saying, from this perspective, from a movement perspective, there are a lot of things that follow in terms of the paradigm that we're using for understanding what public service means and how we realize it. And some of the methods that we'll talk about, if we can find ways of integrating them into the way that we're doing large-scale change, the prize is huge because they add up to not just achieving impact, not just improving care, but enabling our people to go on and do great things. So what organising and mobilising are concerned with is developing our people being as important as achieving the end goal, and actually developing the community and by extension the leaders within it. We are able to achieve the end goal. So it's actually a completely different way of looking at how we get change to happen compared to a programmatic response. The last thing I want to show you is a quote from Marshall Ganz, who is a professor now at Harvard University, but he spent 50 years organising in the civil rights movement and with farm workers in California. And what I like about this quote that I'm going to share with you is that it speaks to the element of courage, which is key to taking the first steps in doing this sort of work as system leaders within the NHS. Marshall says, we need to remember that stories not only teach us how to act, they inspire us to act. Stories communicate our values through the language of the heart, our emotions, and it is what we feel, our hopes, our cares, our obligations, and not simply what we know that can inspire us with courage to act. So on that note, I'm going to turn over to you, Elaine, and just see what thoughts are coming through and what questions are coming through from the chat so far.
Thanks, Catherine, and I'm going to draw on my colleagues as well because chat has been on fire. So you've really stimulated everybody with those thoughts, Catherine. Lots of folk agreeing with you about the importance of value-based and about building those personal narratives. And we've had lots of people commenting, sort of building on that actually, in terms of how it sort of resonates for them. So Anne Tasker is saying narrative is so powerful, it moves mountains, it goes directly to the person, not the title, it knows no boundaries. And I think that knowing no boundaries is really key to this, isn't it, Catherine?
Mm. Yeah, it is, and I think there's kind of some aphorisms around it, but no titles, only people is one that the kind of co-production movement has picked up. But I think the inspiring point about that is it doesn't matter what level we operate within at a formal hierarchy. We have the potential to create substantive change by using some of these methods. There is nothing in this that relies on formal permission in order for us to get started.
Yeah, and I think people are seeing this as a potential mechanism to help them. So people like Joe Murray are saying empowering staff is definitely a challenge. There are so many external and internal rules that people have become frightened of or disengaged from to make changes. It's very sad to see. And there's a couple of questions. So Peter Halliwell is saying, how do you build resilience in the face of incredibly strong resistance from clinicians who hold the most of the old power? Interested to get your thoughts on that one, Catherine, and then we'll come to Ian to see what he's noticed in chat.
Yeah, no, that's a fabulous question and very astute. I mean, I think, you know, if I move one step removed from clinicians as an example, you know, there's one school of thought in community organising that comes from a guy called Saul Alinsky, who developed models in the 1930s through to the 60s. And Alinsky's work really says, you know, nobody ever gave power willingly. You have to take it, right? So his model is a very oppositional model of thinking about power. And that actually building power with people is a way of being able to challenge some of the structural power balance, of which clinicians as a group could be one example, although, of course, there are many, many individuals within that who operate in different ways. My preference is for a more nuanced look at this, you know, so to say, by taking small actions which stem from this approach, we can create space for everybody, regardless of their position, to think differently, to be enabled to act differently. And one of the things that we can do through that is to identify, in inverted commas, our people. So people who are open to exploring new ways of working. So in recent community organising literature, these are referred to as shapeshifters. You know, people who operate, if I go back here, who operate very much in old power and who have positional power in a hierarchical sense that gives them a lot of currency, but who understand that in order to achieve their objectives, they cannot just pull the lever a bit harder and then wonder why nothing happens. So, you know, I see this in my work, increasingly senior people in positions of old power being interested in coming on a journey to learn how to utilize some of that new power energy. But, you know, I think the problem that's highlighted in the question is very real, because if you look at it in video game terms, you know, you've got Tetris, which is a block-based game, you know, 1990s, blocks fall from the sky onto your head and they get faster and faster until you kind of break down, right? And then you've got a Minecraft, which is a green space where everybody builds things collaboratively together. Tetris is the most popular video game of all time. Minecraft, the second most popular. And I think what we're seeing in the NHS is that those of us who have been raised in a Tetris tradition, an old power tradition, and maybe have comfort within that and know how to navigate it, are kind of coming up against a generation of people who have a Minecraft mindset and who in other areas of our lives experience Minecraft and new power, you know, whether it's commercially or what we expect of public services or how we're thinking politically. So I think there is a real kind of tension point, and perhaps the most effective leaders of the future will be ambidextrous. and we'll be able to move between these two ways of thinking about power. Ian, what else are you seeing in the chat?
1 second while I come off mute. A few things, some good points that people are making. There was a lot of positive response to your story, that people wanted the feedback, saying that it was a beautiful story and a goosebump moment. Also led to a good point from Amanda that not all change is good, and that leads to a need to stand up and say, why are we doing this? Which can be just as hard as starting a change project. And on the questions front, we had one just recently from Rachel Dolan, who's asking, how do we make narratives personal to large groups of people who might only be grouped by a common job role? Very good question.
Yeah, so I guess a question back on the last one was, in the story that I use, which I'll come back to and kind of teach off a bit, I'm hoping that people, regardless of whether we share a job, felt something familiar within that story that spoke to them. And in a way that leads us into what I want to talk about next, which is the frame for stories that we use in mobilizing and organizing. So the purpose of stories and personal stories in organizing is not to tell a story that relates directly to someone's experience. It's to share a story that echoes something within others that speaks to their values. So the question I asked, which was, who amongst us came into the NHS just to be doing a job? It's a rhetorical question, but it's also a story device, because I'm asking you to think about an us. I'm inviting you to think that you have something in common with me. And I'm trying to ask you also to reflect on, in your own way, in your own context, and remember what brought you into the NHS in the first place. So the power of stories, in other words, transcends context. The point of them is to trigger in us, to evoke in us something that is much bigger than the specific facts that are being relayed. And in a way, if I contrast that with what we often understand as data, that is its biggest power that pure data does not have, is that it rests in factual information and it transcends that factual information too. So I'm going to start with the frame that we use for thinking about organizing and mobilizing through narrative, which reflects the basis of that question. So it's called Self-Us Now. And every story that you hear in organizing and many stories in politics use this frame in order to make sense of how narrative moves people. And it dates from the Rabbi Hillel, who in the 1st century BC was writing in Jerusalem. And to our knowledge, this is the first time that this organizing frame was written down. So the Rabbi Hillel, the story goes, was asked 3 questions. Rabbi, how do I know how to be in the world? Sorry, 1 question. And he answered with 3 questions. He said, if you want to know how to be in the world, ask yourself this. If I am not for myself, who will be for me? In other words, start by looking at yourself, asking some real difficult questions about why I do what I do in the world, why I don't do what I don't do, what makes me tick. And ask yourself not through generalisms like, I love equality or I care about social justice. Try to remember the moments that describe you, the choices that you made that led you to where you are. And on that basis, you can start to build a story of self. Another way of putting that is that as humans, we are hardwired to think through narrative. So a lot of the ways in which we make sense of the world are narrative. And if we are going to presume to ask other people to come with us through uncertainty, in circumstances where we're putting ourselves at risk, we may be vulnerable, we may fail, then we better make darn sure that we can explain who we are, why we think it matters, in a way that other people can connect with. And that's the challenge that the Rabbi Hillel's first frame, the story of self, is putting out there. If I'm going to presume to lead, to create a shared purpose with others, then I have to be sure that I can give an account of myself in public life. The second question the rabbi said to ask is, if I'm for myself alone, then what am I? Because to be a who in the world and not a what means that we exist in relationship with each other. You know, we are interdependent with each other. And my ability to achieve my goals is inextricably linked to your ability to achieve yours. So what the rabbi and what this question invites us to think about is a story of self and a story of us. My story of self was that as a barrister I was really challenged, not by the cases that I lost that I should have won, but by the cases that I won that I should have lost. And my question of us was, and who amongst us wants to live that kind of life? Who amongst us wants to do public service when we're just going through the motions? And that's the story of us. If I am alone, then what am I? So creating narratives that speak to a bigger sense of people's values is the second step. And then the third step in the frame is now. If not now, when? So what's the point of my story that I shared? Well, the point is that I left, I quit, and I went and found a better way. And I did that because I feel a sense of urgency for what we can create in the health service now. Okay? So maybe taking some time to reflect, what is it in my work that has this story of now, this sense of urgency? Why can this improvement not wait? Why is this situation intolerable? What is my vision for the world as it should be? And how do I describe the world as it is now so that it just can't wait and we have to act? That was his challenge. 3 frames for thinking about stories. A story of self, a story of us, and a story of now. And you know, when you start to think about community organising and mobilising in this way, you'll see this frame being used repeatedly in all sorts of different ways. And I'll give you a couple of case studies of how that's done. So just to recap on that, you know, the story of self is about asking about our choices, challenges that we faced, what has happened to us, whether childhood, family or work, that we could share in a public context. Not so that somebody can say, I had exactly that same experience, but so that I can speak to something bigger. It's the us, the calling to, the inviting people to realise that they can act with you. And the point of this is what Martin Luther King didn't call a story of now. He called it the fierce urgency of now. You know, why do we need to align cancer pathways and genomics more closely now? Why can that not wait? Or whatever piece of work that you're working on, you know, thinking through that lens of pure emotional urgency might lead you to being able to articulate with your colleagues purpose in a more urgent way. But as I said, it starts with me, right? So David White said this, I do not think you can really deal with change without a person asking real questions about who they are and how they belong in the world. And that's the basis of what we're talking about. So I'm going to share a couple of case studies that show what this looks like when it's applied. Just before I do, because for some people it kind of triggers a penny drop, this is what I mean when I'm talking about the fierce urgency of now. What do we want? When do we want it? And maybe it's a provocation again, but it's thinking, how often when we plan for large-scale change do we apply the programmatic lens for thinking about it to the neglect of thinking about the emotional component, the movement component in a literal sense? So 2 case studies from me, and then I will pause again to see what people are making of what they're hearing. First one will be familiar to many of you, but I will kind of set it out in a way that anybody who hasn't heard the story can access. There was a remarkable woman who was the same age as me. Her name was Kate Granger. She was a junior doctor, and she was progressing well in her career when she was blindsided by a realization that she was severely ill and was diagnosed with cancer. Following numerous treatments, Kate started to make a recovery, but during the 2nd year of her recovery, she started to feel unwell again. Subsequently, Kate described a moment when she had returned to the hospital to receive her latest test results. She describes being in a room on her own and a doctor coming in to see her. In her story, she said, you know, the doctor came into the room and without making eye contact, or asking if I wanted anybody with me. He simply told me my cancer had spread. Kate describes how she went home and shared this story with her husband, Chris. And after a couple of days of sharing this story and feeling real hurt at what she had experienced, Chris basically said, put up or shut up. Either do something with it or don't. So Kate sent one simple tweet. She said in her tweet, "I'm going to start a campaign called #HelloMyNameIs, where everyone in the healthcare system introduces themselves. It's one simple act." Now, for those of you who know about the Hello, My Name Is campaign, you will know that from that one tweet, she grew a campaign. From that campaign, we grew a movement in the NHS about one simple act of introducing who we are as the start of any interaction that we have with people who are patients. And the Hello, My Name Is campaign went on to raise millions of pounds for charity, to have social media presence, not just in the UK, but across the world. And is something, since Kate has passed away, that her husband Chris continues to this day to build on. I want to ground that story of Kate and her extraordinary work in a frame of self-us now. Kate went to speak in an event in 2014 called 1,000 Lives. It was a national learning event, and she was speaking to students who were just about to join the NHS as professionals. She said this: "If you put yourself in my position, I'm 29 years old, I know I've got cancer. I think it's confined to my abdomen. I'm in a side room, a junior doctor comes to see me. I'd never met him before. He came into the room, sat down in a chair and looked away from me. Without any warning or asking whether I wanted anyone with me, he just said, 'Your cancer has spread.'" Story of stuff. And she says of her campaign, look, it's something very simple that we all can do. Patients are people. We should treat everyone we look after like a member of our own family. She is calling to our value set. It is a call to action around something beautifully simple. And she says this now, look, if we get the simple things right now for students in their careers, it's going to bode well for the future of healthcare. And that thread of self-us now, very simple frame, Kate used. But she was able to convey it with such simplicity because she had thought very deeply about each of these three questions. Who am I? What is my experience? How does it speak to others? And where is the urgency of what I'm asking people to do now? Which is something so simple that any of us can do it. And cumulatively, we can transform health and care. I'll give you one more case study, and then Elaine, I'm going to come back to you. Barack Obama, unheard of in 2004, a junior senator from Illinois, received the nod to give the speech which introduces the presidential candidate, Al Gore, onto the stage at the Democratic National Convention. It's a big gig. There were lots of jokes at the conference about who is this guy with a funny name. Nobody had heard of him, no one knew what to expect. That speech that he gave in 2004 is now legendary, of course, because it launched a career that launched everything that followed in terms of his presidential work. But what he said followed this exact frame. Barack was, of course, a community organizer before he entered politics. He said, look, my presence on this stage is unlikely. My father was a foreign student, my grandfather a cook, a domestic service to the British, and he had larger dreams for his son. Most of his speech spoke to us. I stand in knowing that my story is part of a large American story, and that in no other country on earth is my story even possible. He is speaking, of course, to the American dream, and to this idea that unites through so much complexity and difficulty the American psyche. And now his ask this year, in this election, we are called to reaffirm our values and commitments, not something that can wait. Before I come to Elaine, this is kind of the key point for me, that successful organising and movement approaches don't wait for the perfect moment for change. They grab that moment, they shape it, they frame it, they define it for what it is. And we, any of us, are capable of doing that in our work. To say, what is it about this moment in time that we have control of, that we have permissions on, where we can make even tiny changes that add up to something bigger. So Elaine, what are people saying in the chat?
Well, basically, I think you've resolved people to tears with those case studies, Catherine, and it's really resonating around how people, as brave as Kate Granger, have kind of used that story of self, us and now, and there's lots of chat going on where people are sharing how that's moved them and touched them, and has actually called them to action now to go make a difference about things. And I think there are two particular comments I wanted to pick out, then we'll see Ian and Jane actually what you might have picked up in chat. Two things that really resonated with me. So John Stubbs a little while back was saying, actually we need to remember that people ultimately want to do the right thing. It's just that we all see the world differently. And being able to gain that buy-in with these different people is so important on a head and heart level. And I think that really resonates with what you've been saying. And Cathy Walsh, I think this is a fantastic comment from Cathy. And you have to go with this because you have to break it down in a wee little bit. So Cathy is saying, asking what matters to people. That's people in capital letters, not staff, not patients. People, we are all people. So listening to what matters is an incredible way to get everybody's views and stories.
I think those two, so thank you for that, because I think those two comments are linked. Because they're both talking about kind of the power of narrative to transcend. And one of the things that the first comment was making me think was, you know, yes, this does start from a theory of people, if you like, which is intrinsically people want to do the right thing. You know, very few of us get out of bed and think, right, I'm going to be a pain today, I'm going to make things difficult. What narrative enables is for us to access the value set that sits under that, to understand why people behave in different ways. You know, so I'll give you an example. You know, often in the NHS we talk about, you know, justice. And when I used to train activists in the trade union movement, they often talked about equality. You know, what I want is equality, and that's great. But my challenge to them was, you know, there are some far-right activists and some conservative activists who also want equality. It's just that they have a radically different definition of it. So we need to move beyond talking about generalizations like justice or equality or equity and actually go deeper on what those things mean to me in order to create that sense of us, where we have a shared understanding of what we're trying to do, not in abstractions, in general terms, but in terms that are grounded. And it's that stories enable. It sort of links to the question earlier about resistance and clinicians. You know, very rarely, in my view, are people resistant for the sake of being resistant. It happens, but what if we looked at some of the science around resistance? For example, Mark Jabin's work, and I'll put a link to that in the chat box, where he talks about, you know, thinking less of resistance and thinking about reactance. Why is it that someone is reacting in that way? What is the relevant information that I'm not seeing or I'm not understanding that means I'm getting that reaction? You know, and when we stop to think about resistance no longer as sort of an immovable force, which is a battle to be overcome, and start thinking about it as a series of reactions from which we can learn because we are missing something very relevant, it transforms the whole way that we think about who our people are and how we can bring other people into the work that we're doing. So I found that idea quite useful, and I think using stories is one of the key ways of both giving an account of who we are and perhaps helping other people to unlock that as well. Elaine and Ian, were there any further comments just before I move into the final piece of content?
Yeah, Ian, over to you.
There's a good point that I'd like to pick up. There's been some interesting discussion about various things, certainly one about involving different groups, patients, voluntary sector, and how they can contribute. But also an interesting point, which I think segues a little bit from what you were just saying, Catherine. There's been a bit of discussion about large systems and large bureaucracies and how they seem to have perhaps forgotten that they're populated with people. And what are your thoughts around large bureaucracies and systems, which many of us, of course, work in, and how we can make some of these mobilizing tactics work within that context?
Yeah, I think that's a real risk, because if we had more time together, you know, we could do like quite a deep dive, for example, on a story of us. By definition, to have a story of us, there is a story of them, right? So by definition, in order to define a collective, there needs to be something to which it is opposed. And I suppose in terms, so I'm talking in psychological terms here, but that very much plays out the further removed we get from an individual empathic relationship with a person. So when you think about that at a system level, you know, one of the challenges we face is kind of us and them, and the depersonalization that comes as soon as we prime our minds to think in system terms rather than to think in human terms. I think that narrative can help with that. I think that relies on people in positional authority using stories, being unashamed to share stories that are personal, not private, but personal, in order to explain what motivates them. I think at whatever level we're at, practicing sharing stories, being a little bit vulnerable in that respect, in and of itself gives permission for other people and creates the conditions within which other people can do likewise. And extraordinary things can happen as a result. Now I'm just looking at the time, Ian. I wanted to just move on and perhaps bring you in about 10 minutes time as we move towards wrapping. Is that okay?
That'll be perfect,
yeah.
Catherine.
Yeah.
On mute. Yes.
Great, okay. So I'm aware that we framed this as a mobilising and organising session, so it would be remiss of me not to offer some thoughts about what the differences between those concepts are. One three-point frame is this, and this comes from the work of Professor Hari Khan, who is a political scientist now working in the States. She did a lot of work through the Obama campaigns to understand what it was enabling and what it was challenging in terms of civic organisation. So Hari talks about three types of organising. She talks about lone wolves. So these are experts, sometimes experts by experience, who operate primarily individually. They offer comments, analysis, they have expertise which is held through their particular knowledge. They are invited to speak to things or to offer views. She contrasts that with mobilizers. So mobilizers are people who start with an issue, a what, and work to create moments in time where others come together to coalesce around that issue. So if you think about a petition, or you think about a flash mob, or you think about a day of action, such as NHS Change Day that ran for many years in the autumn, those were drawing on mobilizing principles. The idea being that we each take one small action in order to make a change. Now, I would invite you to contrast that with organising, and community organising in particular. So the purpose of community organising is to develop leadership capacity, people who are able to create shared purpose with others in order to transform them and through them the community. So in organising, the ultimate goal, the issue, is important, but it is secondary to the why, to the self, and to the us. So the primary role of organising is to build capacity in the sense of relationships, the ability to do things together regardless of what the issue is. And that is then overlaid with the issue. So for example, when I was organising living wage campaigns in 2011 to 2013, the issue emerged through deep listening campaigns on particular university campuses. The students defining the issues that they wanted to work on themselves, then negotiating with cleaning staff around what they wanted to work on, and between them designing a campaign which secured the living wage on campus. Through that, cleaners and students developed relationships that they had never previously had, and they then went on to organise on other issues right across the university for the next 2 years. The issue was important, but it was secondary to the people. So organising is a way of thinking about people that sits like this. People who have ideas and drive are on every street, in every project, every workplace and school. They are waiting and ready to be discovered. Someone has to reach them and recognise them. Someone has to ask them to step out, not to be consumers or props or spectators, but to be players in the unfolding drama of public life. And that someone, in organising terms, is what we call a leader or an organiser. So it has virtually nothing necessarily to do with positional power. It's about a mindset towards the purpose of relationship with other people. And it's about thinking not just how do I get things done through people, but how is what we are doing building your capacity, your agency, your ability to act on any issue beyond what we're doing together here today. So it's a radically different way of thinking about purpose in public service. And it has a strong evidence base. So the final idea I want to show you is this. It comes from research that was done in an amazing but bureaucratic organisation where tens of thousands of people were interviewed, where large data sets were collected. I wonder if anybody might want to guess what the organisation was. It was the NHS. It was research from 2015, and what the researchers found was, as a change agent, my centrality in the informal network is more important than my position in the formal hierarchy. In other words, my development of skills and confidence and experience to enact change from the space in which I am with other people, building networks and connections as I go, that both enables them and achieves the outcome. That is the most effective, sustainable way of making change, rather than relying solely on formal hierarchy. So it's a both and, right? It's a paradox. We need to work out how we harness the best of both. So just to close, I want to root this in the model for large-scale change. So firstly, to recap, that in community organising terms, we have three measures of success. Did I accomplish my goal? Did our community grow stronger? By which we mean capacity, new power, power that we didn't have before. And did individuals involved learn, grow, and develop their capacity to organise with others? And in terms of a model of large-scale change that you're looking at across this series, it really sits on that left-hand side. But I think this mindset informs each of the other parts of this, whether it's improvement tools, how we think about spread and adoption, which is a whole other topic in organising. It's a great topic. Measurements, system drivers. So it's a piece, but it sits within that whole. And actually seeing it in that way as you go through this series of webinars will help you to unlock how you can bring it in small ways into your work. So the last thing I want to say is, there's a lot of ideas here that may be new for some people, perhaps not for others. Really, it's about micro steps. It's about prototyping small ways of using this approach, and that knowing that you will meet with information that you've missed, right? Not resistance, but things that you need to learn that will enable this to work better. I love this piece of art. This was a huge piece of art on a glass wall. It was made up of, I think, about 4,000 tiny orange plastic soldiers. And Adam Katz put them together to say that all of my good ideas are battles. And as Huxley said, new truths begin as heresy. So there has never been a time when I have wanted to start a campaign, think differently about how we use these approaches, where I've gone to somebody and they've said, that's a great idea, have £1 million, off you go. It's about fighting to make it happen in small ways at every stage, and trying so far as we can, when we meet resistance, in inverted commas, to reframe it as a gift from which we can learn, and almost a challenge as to how you get that person invested in what you're trying to do. On this, I would say the first follower principle applies. So in organising, we talk about the most important person in making a change not being the person who has the idea. The most important person is the person who follows that idea first, because when that happens, it moves from being a self to being a we. So maybe another reflection point is, as people who want to lead or instigate change, do we do enough to look after our first followers? Do we do enough to support them to have the resilience that they need? Because if we don't, then effectively we're operating as lone wolves, and that can be a very lonely place, right? So that's the end of what I wanted to say. We do have a few minutes, I think, Elaine and Ian, to go back to you for any questions or final thoughts.
Thanks, Catherine. Absolutely so much fascinating commentary there for everyone to reflect on. There's been some really interesting chat threads going in the chat box. A couple of things I've picked out, and I'll just quickly come back to Ian again in the last couple of minutes that we have before we do the closing bits and pieces. Natalie Booth, I think, has been really insightful in this, and she's mentioned a couple of things that really resonated for her around your word resistance and actually about reactions. And she's saying actually that's a real take-home message for her. She hears her colleagues use the terms resistance a lot, and she's going to really now try to think about reactions much more in the future. What's behind those, understanding those reactions, how can I respond to them? And she goes on to actually say with resistance, she always now likes to ask the question, am I part of the problem? I mean, that's really insightful, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is. That's great to hear. Thank you for that, Natalie. That's great.
Yeah, and I think the last one from me, and I'll quickly check in with Ian then, Amanda Pollard-Wilkins has said there is never a lone wolf. There is always someone out there that will be thinking the same. Try putting your ideas out there, newsletters or on posters. And it is about that, isn't it? It's about reaching out. Who are your people? Who else can you connect with, motivate, work with you to take things forward?
I think that's right, and what I would add to that is, you know, there is a perspective in healthcare that our structures are designed to encourage lone wolf behaviour, and you know, that is some people's perspective. And if that's something that resonates with you and you're in a position of leadership, it might be thinking, what am I doing here that enables people to move beyond just being by themselves and create spaces where they can do that combining, as Alexis de Tocqueville said, building those relationships, finding their allies, and moving people from being in opposition to being allies with them. What am I doing to make that happen for them?
Yeah, and your words literally are resonating in chat now about people saying who is in your tribe, you know, how do we become more than one? And John saying if you win over a skeptic, they will become a devotee. So I think there's lots of people commenting on that. Ian, very quickly, I think we've just got 1 more minute with Catherine just before we close. So any other thoughts from yourself?
Very quickly, a question related to that topic of putting your ideas out there came a little bit earlier from Isabel Ho about how can we action, and is Twitter the only platform that we can use to pull like-minded people together? Or are there other options in your experience, Catherine?
Well, all of my work was face-to-face organising. So I was raised, if you like, in the Alinsky tradition, which existed before computers, never mind the internet. I think, you know, some tools are useful. Twitter is a tool. If you find it useful as a way of connecting, then great. You know, we in our team have maybe 150,000 followers on Twitter in our small team, so we're big fans of it as a team. I still think that, you know, there's a lot that we can do in our immediate sphere as well to change just everyday practices of the way that we're thinking about our work.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so Catherine, huge thank you for that absolutely fantastic presentation, and people are just saying how inspired they've been by the thoughts that you've challenged them to actually go away and consider now. So massive thanks from us. And if people want to sort of carry on this conversation, Catherine, I guess we can engage through Twitter, can't we, and also through our collaboration spaces, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, that's absolutely great, and I'm just going to, I know I'm annoyed if I don't put it in now, Elaine, my Twitter handle there, so
yes.
do reach out to me with your thoughts. I'd love to hear them.
Thank you so much, Catherine. So just before everybody disappears, just a couple of reminders from ourselves. So if you haven't joined already, we do have our Virtual Academy of Large-Scale Change collaboration space available to you. Details are on the screen now, and pop in the link in the chat box for you. If you have any problems joining at all, do get in touch with Rachel Gray and she will help you out. And we will share all the resources from these webinar series with you through that collaboration space. Coming up next week, we have equally fantastic session for you on measurement for improvement, which lots of you raised as an area in the change model session that you really would value some help and support with. So we're going to be joined on that session by Sam Riley, who's Head of Improvement Analytics from NHS Improvement, and Alison Johnston, our colleague in SI, who's a Measurement and Evaluation Manager. and that session runs from 12:30 until 1:30 next Thursday. So please do register for that session if you haven't already. And a special early heads up for everybody who's a current member of our Virtual Academy, which is all of you guys out there right now. We literally are launching tomorrow our expressions of interest for the Virtual Academy of Large-Scale Change Masterclasses. So if you're interested in learning a lot more about the frameworks, the tools, the techniques and the approaches around large-scale change and system leadership, do please download the information around these masterclasses from our collaboration space or our Virtual Academy webpage on the NHS England website. We have a 2-day session on system leadership and leading large-scale change on the 20th and 21st of September in London, or the 26th and 27th of September in Leeds. And if you come to that 2-day session, you'll have the option of also coming to our Knowledge, Network and Impact Masterclass, which runs in October. Applications to an expressions of interest process, please do start popping those in, and we'll look forward to getting your applications. Okay, so a little bit more on that next week. Lastly on your screen, because we're rapidly running out of time, some additional resources you might want to tap into. Colleagues in our team are running a webinar on the 7 deadly spins of knowledge sharing in networks. We'll share those links with you in the chat space now. And also our Improvement Fundamentals course, Introduction to QI Theory, is now open. Okay, it is 1:30. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a lovely afternoon, and we'll look forward to joining you all again next week. Thank you, and bye-bye.